Okay, well, good afternoon all, and welcome to this meeting of the South West Wales Corporate Joint Committee on the 26th of July 2022. I would like to make you aware that today's meeting will be recorded. Can I please remind you all to switch your phones to silent for the duration of the meeting and that your microphones are switched to mute unless you are speaking. Should you wish to ask a question or make a comment, could you please indicate via the chat function or by raising your electronic hand. So as monitoring officer for the CJC, I'll be officially opening this meeting and I'll move to agenda item 2, which is the appointment of the chair and vice chair. So I wonder at this stage whether I could have a nomination, please, for the position of chair and vice chair for the forthcoming civic year. Councillor Miller?
Thank you. Not sure about vice chair, but happy to move Councillor Stewart for the chair.
Could I have a seconder, please, for the position of for chair?
Happy to second that, Craig.
Thank you very much. So are all members in favour of Councillor Stewart please being appointed as chair for this meeting? For the duration of the year, I apologise. Great, I think we can assume that's all in order. Councillor Stewart, would you be happy to take the chair's position, please?
Thank you, Craig, and thank you, everyone. Very, very grateful for your support. Can I then call for nominations for vice chair, please?
If I could come in there, Chair, I think the intention was that Councillor Price, the Executive Leader of Carmarthenshire Council, was to be nominated as Vice Chair for the purposes of the civic year. So I'm happy that members can nominate him in his absence, or alternatively, we could defer that to the next meeting. But I think nominating in his absence will be absolutely fine.
Okay, thank you for that, Craig. Councillor Lenny?
Yes, in that case, I'll nominate Councillor Darren Price.
Okay, could I ask for a seconder, please?
Happy to second that, Chair.
Thank you, colleagues. Any other nominations? If not, could I ask you all for your support for Councillor Price? You could show. Thank you very much. Okay, that concludes the elections business. So we'll move on then to item 3, which is the declarations of interest. Are there any declarations any members wish to declare for today? I can't see any. Okay, thank you. We'll move then to item 4, which is the constitution of corporate joint committees. And I'll come back to Craig for that item, please, Craig.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. So this is a period administrative report that we have to bring on an annual basis to the Corporate Joint Committee. It's just confirming our arrangements for future meetings during the course now of the next civic year, taking us to what will be June 2023. Essentially, we're going to be adopting the same approach that we did in January this year when the Corporate Joint Committee met, and we will be reconstituting on the exact same basis as we did then. So just to give an overview as to what this report actually sets out, we will be creating 4 separate subcommittees to the CJC, which will provide the cabinet members of the respective authorities and the lead members from the national parks who have been nominated. And we have 4 subcommittees covering the areas of regional transport, economic well-being, strategic development, and our regional energy strategy. There will be a political lead and a lead chief executive to each of those subcommittees. And what we'll be asking today is just to constitute those meetings. No dates have been set in the diary at the moment, but it will be capable of meeting as and when ultimately required. It's also a requirement of the CJC to nominate and constitute a governance and audit subcommittee. So in discussions with regional partners, we have now established obviously the membership of the governance and audit subcommittee, and they are included in the report today for members to adopt. We are also obliged to have a standards committee, and it's been concluded previously that because of the limited nature of what the standards work will entail, it made more sense ultimately for one local authority standards committee to be designated as the standards committee for the CJC. So Neath Talbot County Borough Council will take over that function subject to members' approval here today. Again, we are also required to have a scrutiny committee. And again, we have that process set up where members now need to be appointed to the scrutiny subcommittee, and that meeting will first take place in September this year, and a regular programme of meetings then will ultimately continue from that point. Paragraph 27 of your report will also see a proposed meeting timetable, which will set out the various meetings that the CJC will have now over the course of the coming year, and there will be a forward work programme circulated in due course, so members will be able to see what items will be down for consideration at those particular meetings. But the majority of the other committees then will be set up, ready to be established as and when we require them during the course of the year. So a purely administrative report for myself, Chair, in that regard, just to make sure we're on the right footing for the next year. I'd be happy to take any questions that members may have on it, but if not, I would ask you to approve accordingly.
Thank you, Craig. Are there any technical questions to Craig on anything in the body of the report? If not, then we'll move to ratify. Sorry, William, your hand's up.
Thank you, Chair. It's just one observation from an officer perspective. We've been very specific on the subcommittees that you're having a lead chief executive there, but not specific on the political lead that a local authority might provide. Might I suggest one small amendment would be a technicality and not being over specific about the officer lead from each local authority. Something that perhaps I should have picked up much earlier in the staffing process, and my apologies.
I'll go back to Craig on that one, but I think we've got that flexibility already, so I think that would seem reasonable. Is that all right, Craig?
That's absolutely fine. Yes, it can be an officer lead as opposed to the chief executive. That makes no difference in that sense, so we can easily incorporate that as part of our amendments here today, Chair. Okay,
thank you. And Tegrin.
Yeah, thank you. I think in a previous meeting, it was indicated that there was a plan to have a meeting with the Welsh Government and the 4 CJCs to clarify where National Park Authority representatives fitted into some of the issues covered by this. Is there any, I'm not aware that a meeting has been scheduled, so I was just thinking if there was an update, and I assume any outcome of that would be reflected in changes if they were required in the future.
Okay, thanks, Tegrin. You're absolutely right. We were going to do that. I don't believe that meeting has taken place with certainly with the 4 chairs of the CJCs. Craig, any update in terms of response from Welsh Government on that?
Of course, Chair. So as officers of the CJC, we've met with the Welsh Local Government Association, who are taking that matters through to Welsh Government to try and get more clarity on the issue of the national parks element. There was some correspondence that was issued a couple of weeks ago, which just gave an overview of what the statutory provisions are in respect of national parks, but there are further discussions ongoing. I would imagine hopefully at the end of the summer recess, coming into the early autumn, one of those meetings will ultimately be convened. But the regional group of meetings is taking place, we believe, now in the autumn to try and get more clarity on the national park involvement, and obviously then whatever comes out of those we can reflect back as part of the discussions within the Corporate Joint Committee and consider any amendments that may be necessary at that point.
Okay, thank you, Craig. If there aren't any other questions or clarifications, then I'm happy to move the recommendations on page 7 of the report. Could I ask for a seconder, please?
Happy to second, Chair.
Thank you, Steve. And therefore we'll go to the vote. I just remind members for these items, it is only local authority members that have a vote on these items. So if I could ask my local authority colleagues to show if they're in favour of the recommendations. Okay, that is carried. Thank you very much. We'll go on then to item 5, which is the co-optees of the Corporate Joint Committee on pages 15 to 20 of your report. Craig, over to you again.
Thank you very much, Chair. So members will recall at the meeting in January this year where we created the Constitution for the Corporate Joint Committee, we built in the requirement to have the potential for members to be co-opted onto this Corporate Joint Committee so we could have the breadth and experiences of various different organisations. So accordingly, discussions have been ongoing in recent times, and we're now in a position to recommend to members that they consider co-opting representatives of the 2 local health boards that serve the area, along with the 2 universities as well. So included within your report on page 15 are the identities of those particular individuals. So with approval today, Chair, we'd like to issue a formal co-option agreement to those 4 for them to attend future meetings of the Corporate Joint Committee. It's important to note that they'll be here as observers and contributors only. They have no voting rights, or they're not able to take part in any detailed elements of voting and agree any certain priorities. That remains ultimately with the corporate members of the Corporate Joint Committee. But you'll be here to have their breadth of experience and their knowledge to make sure that the views are being taken into account accordingly. So with your approval, Chair, if this item is passed today, I'll be issuing co-option agreements with the aim that they'll be able to take their place as co-opted members from September onwards.
Okay, thank you, Craig. And just for members who may not be involved in the Swansea Bay City Region Joint Committee, again, we have effective and really good relationships with both health boards and universities on that structure. And again, it's sensible, I think, to give them the opportunity to attend these boards, but as Craig says, without voting rights. Okay, any questions or clarifications for Craig on anything in the report? I don't see any hands. So again, I'm happy to move that. Could I ask for a seconder, please?
Happy to second, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And again, for local authority colleagues, again, if you could show whether you're in favour of the recommendations. Again, thank you very much, colleagues. That's carried. So we'll move then to item 6, which is a presentation by transport officers, and the detail is covered within pages 21 to 44 of the report. So who's going to lead on this item?
Chair, that's myself, Steve Polina from
Carmarthenshire,
going to lead, and officers from the region will contribute at the end of the presentation as well. Chair,
okay,
that's okay.
Fantastic, Steve. Over to you then.
Thank you very much. Shall I share the presentation that for members, so I can take members through that? So. Hopefully, you should be able to see that.
I can see it, Steve. Can everybody see that? Does that come up on everybody's screen? Everybody happy? Yeah, lovely. Can see some thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, Steve, over to you then.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Chair. The presentation in the pack for members sets out the current position with transport, and in particular, transport planning across the region. As members will be aware, it's the first responsibility for the corporate joint committee. And I've set out, hopefully, as we go through the presentation, some of the policy drivers that will shape the regional transport plan. A bit about the history, informing members of where transport planning has been, where it's sat at various stages over a number of years, the governance and arrangements and structure that we've currently got, then looking at some of the enablers around the RTP guidance and timescale to be able to deliver the plan. Some of the work that's been ongoing in terms of preparing for the future, and that's particularly important in terms of transport schemes, because they have to go through what's called Welsh Transport Appraisal Guidance, involved with working with partners, then something about the ambition, and then project delivery in terms of what's been going on across the region to support the movement of goods and people. And then right at the end, in terms of a little bit about the structure required to deliver the RTB governance. You will already be aware in terms of the need for a transport subcommittee, which Craig has touched on earlier, and then the delivery resource to deliver the transport plan itself. So in terms of the policy drivers, Future Wales, the national plan, sets out the priorities for land use planning for the future. Transport is a derived demand, as we're aware. So where development occurs will shape the movement of goods and people. And then last autumn, the Welsh Government published the Wales Transport Strategy, which set out the vision for transport for providing an accessible, sustainable and efficient transport system, and focusing the priorities around people and climate change, with an ambition to have fewer cars and people moving more by public transport. And some of the priorities you'll see within the pack for the Wales Transport Strategy about bringing services closer to people to reduce the need to travel, allowing people and goods to move easily from door to door through an accessible, sustainable and efficient transport network. And then right at the bottom, then it concentrates on developing public transport and walking and cycling through the active travel priorities, which we'll all be familiar of. Public transport, in terms of some of the change that's ambition around that, is likely to require changes to bus legislation. And of course, we've got the bus reform work that's going on within Welsh Government in partnership with Transport for Wales. There was bus legislation intended for the next session of the Senedd. That's been put back for consideration to next year's Senedd session. And of course, we've got the roads review that's been ongoing as well. From a transport planning perspective, before 2006, it was a local authority responsibility. Authorities were asked to collaborate together across the region from about 1998 to 2006. Transport Act Wales was amended then to make it a regional responsibility. And from 2006 to 2013, we had a formally constituted body in the form of Switch, where the 4 authorities worked together to produce a regional transport plan. Then in 2013, the Transport Act was amended, 2014, and from there onwards, local authorities had that responsibility. But as a region, we all work collaboratively to deliver the joint local transport plan for West Wales, and that's continued today. And of course, now from 2022, we're here today with the Corporate Joint Committee that will have responsibility, and the first responsibility is for regional transport planning. We are, of course, a diverse region. We've got predominantly rural communities to the west, and then we've got the more urban to the east. As I said, we've continued to work collaboratively, and we've got, as officers, we meet monthly, and cabinet members meet quarterly through the Regional Transport Forum. That's not a formally constituted arrangement. Decisions around transport up to this point have been made by local authorities, and then we've got various officer groups under that to take forward work collaboratively around transport planning, programme delivery, responding to consultation and input into the metro development with Wales Government and Transport for Wales. From a passenger transport, public transport aspect, bus funding for bus services support grant is administered jointly between Carmarthenshire and Swansea across the region. Various ad hoc groups around active travel, road safety and parking. And then from a procurement perspective, we have procurement contracts in place for the region dealing with professional design services for our infrastructure development and also construction. There's been some collaboration around fleet procurement as well. So that's the picture today. But as we move forward to the regional transport plans, there are some key enablers that need to be in place for us to take that forward and for the committee to take that forward. So the regional transport planning guidance is critical. That will shape the nature of work that we need to do to develop the RTP for members' consideration. We understand from Welsh Government that the guidance is due in autumn. The ongoing metro work is important, but also as part of that process, the statement of funds that will be available in terms of what's available in terms of delivery of the regional transport plan. And then we've got the National Transport Plan, which will determine the national transport priorities around that. So those are some key enablers that will need to be in place in terms of the regional transport planning process. We've mentioned the subcommittee, and in terms of our policy objectives that members may wish to consider, need to consider, and this report will come to Corporate Joint Committee in September. If I just pick on the top one there, in terms as an objective to improve transport and access within and beyond the region to facilitate decarbonisation, economic regeneration, equality and integration. It's a bit of a catch-all. Transport is a derived demand, but as you move down those objectives, there's a clear focus on economic development as well as moving sustainably as well, both across the region and into the region. So that's some of the policy context. And as I said earlier, transport is a derived demand, and the RTP will have to have due cognizance of those other strategies that will determine the nature of movement across the region, the economic development plan, the strategic development plan, the energy plan, the digital strategy, and of course the city deal. They are the interdependencies that the regional transport plan will need to take into consideration. So in terms of how we've been preparing, or how authorities have been preparing for the future, across Wales, nationally the Welsh Government has aspirations to deliver metro transport systems. There are 3 across Wales. There's North Wales. South East Wales is probably the most advanced, but South East Wales was part of the city deal, so they've probably got a 10-year head start on other parts of Wales, and importantly for this region, Southwest Wales is the 3rd in terms of metro development. Now, as I said earlier, in terms of any bids for funding of transport schemes have to go through Welsh Transport Appraisal Guidance. So there has been a fair body of work ongoing around transport modelling, working with Transport for Wales to understand the nature of movement and the impact of movement on our infrastructure, looking at transport hubs in terms of the business case, preparing for investment in transport hubs, the bus business case in terms of shaping the public transport system for the future, active travel infrastructure around those hubs, around station and hubs. So we've got the last mile of the journey. People are able to travel sustainably and connect into that infrastructure. And then the ultra low emission vehicle strategy linked to the energy strategy. Transport responsibility is quite complex. When you look at it, there are various tiers of government that have different responsibilities. Some of that is devolved, some of it's non-devolved. And the table in front of you sets out where those responsibilities currently lie. Rail is pretty complicated. You've got UK government that's responsible for the infrastructure policy and investment priorities. There is an argument in terms of Wales having its fair share of investment from rail as a consequence of HS2. Welsh Government's responsible for the franchise in Wales and on the Wales network and the Valley lines, but the mainline services are still the responsibility of the UK Government through the Department for Transport. Taxis and public hire vehicles, the regulations around that, national UK Government responsibilities, freight and logistics, ports and marine and aviation. Then coming down the various tiers, we've then got Wales Government with responsibility for policy setting around walking and cycling and active travel, bus, elements of rail, as I mentioned, in terms of the Wales franchise and the Valley Lines network, then roads, street and parking in terms of setting the policy for that, community transport as the main areas that are devolved, and then local authorities, we sit under that with our own policies around that. Then the orange circles in that are the providers, and that's commercial operators, for example, and the and community transport, providing those services to the people on the ground. I've mentioned the various studies that have been underway through Welsh Government and Transport for Wales, initially focused around Wales, looking at studies around rail frequency enhancements and bus corridor enhancements. So there has been work on studies looking at strategic connectivity into the region on the rail network on the South Wales main line, which is quite important because of congestion on the rail network to the east. And then importantly, what happens within the region in terms of that service frequency and connectivity within the region. The further west we go, journey time is critical. It's not competitive with the car journey, and rail journeys suffer as a consequence the further west we go. I'll take you to the next slide in a moment, looking at some of the work around an urban metro as well as more recently looking at that bus corridor work, so we have an integrated transport system. And we see some more emerging priorities around the urban network in terms of the potential for an urban metro. some potential for new stations on that urban metro. All those studies are ongoing at the moment. They're really important to inform so that we've got an evidence base in terms of securing investment for the future, as is that cross-region connectivity referred to in the previous slide. And then in the longer term, we've then got, in terms of once that work is completed, there's studies to look at Amerford, Gwauncae, Gedwin, use of rail there as potential extension of the urban metro, and then you've got services Swansea to Neath, and then up the Neath Valley to Ontline and Cwm Grach. So those studies are ongoing. I won't go into detail today, given there's a fair amount to go through in terms of transport planning. And there is some exciting work going on in terms of transport and decarbonisation. Again, working in partnership with Welsh Government and Transport for Wales. The blue one in the middle is the strategic corridor between Aberystwyth and Carmarthen. There's a plan to use electric buses on that route from early next year. The photograph you see in the middle is the first bus off the production line. Those buses will be arriving into this country shortly, and then the orange bits are looking at potential for hydrogen buses around the urban area from Talbot across to Llanelli and across up into Powys and the north, and then down west in terms of around Haverfordwest, Milford Haven, linking up to Aberystwyth in terms of the energy source. That's at an early concept stage. There are studies ongoing to look at the feasibility of that. The one thing we would say is that the transport sector is in a state of transition in terms of what is the right motive power source for the future, depending on which sector. We've seen prevalence of electric in the light vehicle sector, but more and more we're starting to see the emergence of hydrogen as well. So there's work ongoing around that. And then that, in terms of the strategic bus corridors, we'll look at decarbonising that network as that hydrogen project progresses, and that's the similarly in the west. Given the ambition around bus, there's a lot of interdependencies around bus. There's a lot of things that will need investment in terms of shaping up the bus network. The legislative reform is probably quite an important part of that. The bus network review and some of the studies I've referenced earlier. But then in terms of infrastructure investment, once the RTP determines the policy priorities and the investment required, then that will inform the bus corridor infrastructure investment, working with Welsh Government, and then the decarbonisation bit in orange in terms of depending what power sources is used. And perhaps the most important bit is making it easier for the customers in terms of making information available in terms of real-time passenger information standards, and then ticketing integration, so passengers can get on a bus and they can have one ticket that takes them where they need to go without having to worry about purchasing a ticket on the next bus. That's setting the scene in terms of for the potential for the future, and the work's ongoing around that, and the priorities in terms of, I guess, developing the regional transport plan. But we haven't been standing still as a region, and there's some examples in here of the work that's been delivered in terms of the various sectors of transport from a highway infrastructure perspective, carriageway realignment in terms of road investment, Cross Hands Link Road. Then there's the annual round of Safe Routes in the Community Funding, Local Road Safety Grant, all investment in infrastructure that's designed to encourage both people to travel sustainably, and also in terms of safety around those walking routes. And of course, sadly, as a consequence of climate change, our highways get damaged, and we've had some resilient roads grant funding to be able to repair some of the infrastructure as a consequence of damage around those storms. And then from an electric vehicle charging infrastructures, developments around Swansea Central, in terms of strategic rapid charging hubs, similarly across hands, across the all authorities, public charging stations, electric taxi pilot down in Pembrokeshire, and then public transport infrastructure, the infrastructure schemes being looked at or delivered across the region in each of the authorities the information I've mentioned. And for the rural areas, demand responsive transport schemes, flexi bus in Pembrokeshire, Booker bus in Carmarthenshire, and then active travel infrastructure. I'm sure we'll all be familiar in terms of the level of investment that's come from as a consequence of priorities shifting from Wales Government. And then from rail infrastructure, the first station is intended, new station funded. That fund has come from UK Government at St Clair's railway station, and there's some examples of that's happening on the ground, or scheme outlines for that investment for the future. That was the public transport, active travel follows, and then infrastructure investment scheme down in Pembrokeshire there, Cross Hands Link, Gooding, Cumber Carriageway realignment, as I mentioned, and then some of the storm damage repairs, and then electric vehicle infrastructure, some examples of that's happening across the region. So from a corporate joint committee, in terms of taking regional transport planning forward, there's some key considerations in terms of being able, in terms of having the resource in place to deliver the work that's required, so that committee will be in the position to consider the outputs of the work that's coming forward. As we on the next slide, we'll look at some detail around that in terms of the resource level requirements. We wouldn't be able to do it on the existing level of resource, and having talked to other regions across Wales, they are in a similar position. And the draft terms of reference, as I mentioned earlier, will come forward to corporate joint committee in September. So from a resource level for committee members to consider, proposal is a regional transport plan development and programme lead officer, for that to be in place for the last quarter of this financial year, with a graduate trainee to support. Then, based on the guidance that's coming forward from Welsh Government, based on previous experience of the former regional transport plans, there is likely to be a requirement for specialist studies ongoing, continuing further. So there's a budget line in there for future years members. So that concludes the presentation. As I say, it sets the policy context, looks at some of the enablers, some examples of the vision for the future, particularly around metro, and then looking at schemes on the ground currently, and then the resource levels coming forward. So for members' consideration, Chair, if there's any questions, myself and fellow officers will do our best to answer for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. An exceptionally large amount of stuff to get through in a quick time, but you did a really great job on that. And I think, Stephen, as you you said, there's a lot of work already underway, but really it is now about us taking that to the next level and starting to deliver what is in our grasp, which is not just the potential of an integrated transport system with bus, rail and active travel all connected, but also the functionality in terms of the ticketing and making it easy for passengers to get from one destination to the other, but also then, of course, how we operate those services and the opportunities that the Welsh Government are pursuing to try and give us more control over those services in terms of what is run. I was just going to say, in terms of that, if there are any questions or clarifications or comments for Stephen or any of the other officers here. Obviously, the last slide was one around funding, and I'd be quite happy as chair with the support of colleagues to make sure a letter goes off in terms of raising the funding requests with ministers, so that we make the case for making sure that our work programme can proceed as quickly as possible, as Steve alluded to, because Cardiff's capital region deal included the metro for that region as part of their capital region deal. Obviously, they're a little further ahead than the rest of Wales. We need to be second in that queue, and we need to be pushing both governments to ensure that they are prioritising and funding the necessary works in our region to give us the transport system that we need. So I'm quite happy to suggest that we get that letter out of the way with obviously support colleagues. Steve, I can see your hand up. Steve, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And what you've just said, I 100% support you on that, and I'd second that motion, and I'm sure all other members would agree and support that letter. It's vitally important, I would say. And by the way, Stephen, thank you for that presentation. Very elaborate and informative. A lot going on, obviously, in transport. Transport is a huge programme. To get it right is very difficult, I should imagine. And being parochial, everybody will want their own transport to be sorted out wherever they live, I'm sure. And as a Valley boy, it's always a little bit disappointing when criteria from Welsh Government doesn't allow rural wards perhaps to have active travel, for instance, and other aspects of transport that would make life a lot easier in those wards going forward. I understand the complexities and the issues surrounding the reasons, but I'll always lobby for rural wards and transport to be made available and a lot better and affordable. Because I think a lot that you have in here, the hydrogen buses, for instance, going up the valleys, I would imagine they probably would go through one of my wards, Crynan, when getting to Ystrad. And, I welcome that. There's a lot of transport already happening with Welsh Government services coming down that way now with their own buses in transport. But just the investment, as Rob said, is key. And I think, and then spent wisely in making sure that everybody is provided with a transport that's affordable and achievable going forward. Last thing from me, Rob, I always used to have it of Dave is on the call here, and it always used to remind me that use it or lose it. Well, we get into a stage that we do understand that transport, certainly in buses, it can be very expensive, and therefore that's, given the cost of living crisis, energy crisis and so forth, it's not going to come down anytime soon. But that's another part I think we need to be really mindful of trying to subsidise it, maybe through Welsh Government or Westminster Government, so it's affordable. And therefore, maybe we will get more people on bums on seats, as they say, for the future. But we have to change what is going on. And some of the plans in this report is very good. As I said, if I only looked at it from the side of me on a rural particular instance, then maybe it's not as good. But for Wales and for our regions and everywhere else, it's probably a good way going forward. And I look forward to working with you all on the transport, because that's going to be one of Neath Talbot's sort of remits to work on anyway. So thanks for that, Rob. Sorry I took a bit longer than I intended, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem, Steve. And I think we're all mindful of the need to make sure that all of our communities are connected and benefit from this network. I think it's always worth bearing in mind, though, at the moment we're at the very early stages. We're creating, if you like, the core branches, or the core trunk of the routes, and then obviously the branches come off that. And as you say, with the proposals the Welsh Government are bringing forward for more control for local authorities and for the public sector to have control over the operation of some of those routes, that will allow us to try and make sure that we get a better deal for our residents. And I think the holy grail of this one is to make sure that we get a reliable, affordable service that reaches our communities with the best possible network we can. I'll go to Paul Miller next. Paul.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Stephen, for the presentation. I think it was a useful overview, and I'm conscious that, like others, I've got some catching up to do on the region, sort of a new bit to my portfolio, and obviously I'm standing for David today. I wonder, it may exist and I just don't quite grasp it yet, but I'm quite clear on sort of Pembrokeshire's transport priorities. I'm a bit less clear on how that feeds into the region and what we might have collectively agreed are our transport policies. And then I guess I'm always really keen to see some timescales around these things. So if we as a region do have a set of priorities for delivery, what are the realistic timeframes around those? And then I guess tacking back to our earlier discussion about setting up the governance, what are the accountability mechanisms? What are the structures in place to secure delivery against those timelines? So I think there's two bits to that. The first is sort of how are we tracking and monitoring delivery against our regional transport plan? But that's secondary to, I think, the nub of my question: what is our regional transport plan? I'm clear on Pembrokeshire's priorities. Are we collectively, four authorities, clear on our priorities?
Yep, Steve, I'll bring you in on that point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Miller, for the questions. I think that probably reflects those probably profound questions in terms of there is an opportunity, I think, through the regional transport planning process to shape what that looks like in the future. The regional transport plan will set the policies for the region, and the infrastructure investment will follow those policies, and that will come forward once we've got the regional transport planning guidance issued from Welsh Government. At this moment in time, we're working to the local transport plan, which will be replaced through that regional transport planning guidance. That is the importance of the studies. So we have an evidence base to inform what goes forward in terms of those priorities. The other element of it that is of just as important, and perhaps most important of all, is the level of investment that is going to be available for the region to invest in the improvements that we've talked about in terms of the infrastructure. That will come through the statement of funds. Given this is the first corporate joint committee, and we've heard today about the governance arrangements as a subcommittee for transport, looking forward to that. That should be formalised now when we come through the report coming through in terms of September, in terms of the objectives for the transport subcommittee to be approved by the corporate joint committee. So we've got the governance arrangement as far as decision-making basis around the regional transport plan going forward. But just to reflect, the guidance that comes out in the autumn is critical. It should reflect what's in the Wales Transport Strategy. It should reflect in terms of some of the work that's been ongoing in terms of the metro development. Those are our 3 metro systems across Wales, as I've mentioned. But we are at that probably that moment in terms of it's a turning point, in terms of it's now a regional function. The guidance will then shape and answer those questions in detail that you talked about there, Councillor Miller. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, just to add to that, Stephen, I think just to go back, putting my other hat on as chair of the Swansea Bay City region, we've certainly had conversations there about transport priorities, and that they will not be ones that will be alien to people. We want faster services from the west through to Cardiff, Bristol and London. That's obviously a key priority. We want a connected connected network of stations, so that people actually have local stations they can travel to, which cut their journey times. So that's definitely a priority. And obviously the expansion of the active travel routes, that is also a priority. And then the layering of things like the decarbonisation of the services, the use of electric for rail and battery, the hydrogen for buses, through ticketing, and all of the other stuff that makes it work. So as you said, they were all in your presentation there, Stephen, and they've all been priorities, I think, that we've corralled around for some time. But it's now the getting to the sharp end, really, about how we prioritise that into a plan that's deliverable, that's fundable, and that gets everybody something out of it. Okay, I'll go next to Alan. Alan?
Yes, thank you. I think you've already answered my question, actually, or my remark, that our priority in Carmarthenshire is to get this fast route to Cardiff by rail, because at the moment, as we know, people might drive to Neath or to Port Talbot to catch the train, which rather defeats the purpose. And of course, getting a faster route to Carmarthen, or a faster service to Carmarthen, means a faster service to Pembrokeshire as well. It's looking at scale, it's interesting to note that St David's is further from Swansea than Swansea is from the Severn crossing. So there's a big chunk of West Wales, obviously, that needs to be upgraded, if you like. But as you mentioned, it's already part of one of the priorities. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Alan. I'll go to Darren next.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's Darren Thomas, Head of Infrastructure, Pembrokeshire County Council. I was just going to perhaps add a couple of comments to what Paul was talking about earlier, because certainly what Paul and I have spoken about is that, you know, from his perspective, the administration have priorities, which we have been feeding into the work that Steve Pilliner was presenting there earlier. But because the current transport planning process was produced originally in 2015, obviously it does need refreshing, and that list that you quoted, Chair, you know, is obviously that work that needs to refresh now into the RTP work. But you know, for Pembrokeshire, that sort of connectivity is absolutely vital, and it needs to be expressed probably more clearly in the plans moving forward, which the previous councillor there also mentioned for Carmarthenshire as well. So I'm kind of agreeing with the previous speakers, but I just wanted to stress that, because we as officers are very aware that the old transport planning processes, you know, they expired in 2020. We've been waiting for the new Neath, and now we're waiting now to get going with the regional transport planning process, and we just want to incorporate all of these plans and strategies that you want in the plan as quickly as possible, and refresh it and make sure that we're moving forward. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Darren. That's helpful. Paul, back to you.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so just quickly, that's been a really helpful little discussion from my perspective, actually. But I'm wondering then, following on from Stephen's contribution, so and yours actually, Rob, we've clearly got lots of projects and priorities floating around, and they all sound like good stuff. You know, it's very difficult to argue against any of those aspirations that we've heard. But at some point regionally, we probably do need to have a bit of an arm wrestle about where they sit in our ranking order of priorities and what we're really going to put our shoulder to the wheel against first. What's the right forum for that? When does that happen? Who's involved? That's what I'm interested in, really.
Yeah, and that's really the next phase politically, which is sitting down and giving guidance to the officers in terms of what we do. But of course, we can't do that in glorious isolation, because we're going to UK and Welsh governments for the funding. So it will need to fit with both the plans in terms of their investment portfolios and priorities as well. So I think, yes, we've got, as you've described it, a bit of an arm wrestle locally around not I don't think there's any disagreement about the things that need to be done, but it's about how you unlock that funding and how you get that funding into the region and basically take the cork out of the bottle so the wine can start flowing, if you want to put it that way. So that's the discussion that's coming up. I think we're all ready to have that, because I think you know that we are arranging in the city region a session around some of the major projects that are underway. Obviously, the metro and the transport infrastructure is part of that. So there'll be an opportunity, I guess, in that for us to explore some of the political views in terms of where we stand on some of these major projects. Okay, are there any other questions or comments from anybody? If not, I'll say thank you very much to Stephen and colleagues for their presentation and contributions, really helpful. If members are content, I'll also get that letter drafted in terms of the initial request for funding, because again, we need to start getting that money flowing, even if it's the first small bit. Everybody content with that? I see lots of nodding ahead, so thank you very much. Stephen, I don't know whether that full presentation has been circulated, but if not, can it be after the session, please, for everybody? I think that'd be really welcome.
Yeah, I think it was circulated as part of the pack, but certainly I can circulate, send that through in PDF format for members as well, Councillor Stewart. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, thank you, colleagues. That's the end of item 6. Then our final one was any AOB or urgent items. I haven't been notified of any. So with that, can I once again thank you for your attendance today. Thank you for the conduct of business. I think it was a really good meeting, and look forward to working with you over the coming year. So with that, I'll declare the meeting closed.